In this video, we finally have a book that looks at every single Super NES game. But is it as super as it should be? Let's find out. Hi everyone, John here. In my ongoing quest to fill my brain with more and more Nintendo knowledge, two books I previously reviewed have really stuck with me. Pat Contry's Ultimate Nintendo Guide to the NES Library, which covers every single NES game, and Math Manent's Nintendo 64 Anthology from Geeksline Publishing, which reviews every single Nintendo 64 game. From the latter will also be the GameCube Anthology, which you can expect me to look at as well. But something is missing here. That's right, what about my favorite game console, the Super NES? Surely I'm not the only one who loves this 16-bit entertainment system that dominated much of our leisure time in the 1990s. Luckily, there is at least one other person, retro gaming author Jeffrey Wittenhagen. Under his label Hagen's Alley Books, he has published a number of books about gaming in the 8 and 16-bit eras. I was, of course, intrigued by the Complete SNES Collector's Book and Ultimate Guide, which was the first book of its kind for the Super NES. Not sure why I didn't pick it up the first time around, but maybe it's okay that I didn't, because this book in my hands is actually a second version, dubbed the Definitive Edition. This now includes coverage of homebrew games, PAL exclusives, and over 300 selected Japanese Super Famicom games. Is this the book I've been looking for? Let's check it out. At first glance, you would immediately know what this is. It's called the Complete SNES Collector's Book and Ultimate Guide Definitive Edition, with the latter part stylized like the only for Nintendo tag used on exclusive Super NES games at the time. It's a bit of a mouthful of a title, but we'll just call it the Complete SNES, or the Complete SNES, from here on. As for the cover art, you've got video game heroes and villains from popular Super NES games, seemingly fighting for a Super NES. An interesting cover, which conceptually I do like better than the grotesquely muscular eject button on the original release of this book. Except that mishmashing work from different artists does make it look a little shoddy, like slapped together clip art. This hardcover book, as you might expect, is somewhat hefty, at over 600 pages. By comparison, it is actually very similar in thickness to Pat Contry's NES book, but is maybe a smidge thicker, despite having about 200 more pages than the former, and is actually incredibly close to the size and all dimensions as the Nintendo 64 Anthology, at least when it includes the slipcase and the box art book. At the beginning is an expected intro, a quick console overview, and a look at some controllers and accessories. Then there's an article by the two guys from the YouTube channel My Life in Gaming. Among their videos is the popular RGB Masterclass series, where they talk about the various hardware options and methods to set up game consoles for the best visual quality on modern day TVs. These are very interesting and very informative, and you should check out their channel. And here in this book, they have a short 2-page article that summarizes the ways a Super NES can be set up, as well as the slight differences in hardware between earlier and later models. And now, 26 pages in, we're into the bulk of the Complete SNES, write-ups on every single Super NES game. For each game, we see the front of the box, the title, the number of players, its year of release, as well as the developer and publisher. If a heart appears here, it is considered a favorite, apparently. Though I really question some of the picks. I mean, really? I know it's subjective, but no Street Fighter? So baffling. Anyway, after a 1-paragraph description and a single screenshot, there are also checkboxes for cart, box, and manual, so if you're a serious collector and don't mind marking up this book, you can use these to keep track of what you have and or need to hunt down. The descriptions begin with the 722 NTSC releases. This includes the 718 games for the United States and Canada, plus the 2 Chavez boxing games specifically for the Southwest US and Mexico, and the Super Copa soccer game for South America. That brings it to 721, the official number of licensed games for the Americas. But the book also includes here the only unlicensed Super NES game released at the time, Super 3D Noah's Ark, or as listed here, Super Noah's Ark 3D. So the Complete SNES definitely lives up to its name for this region. Every game gets exactly half a page. If you like consistency, then here you go. There is no deviation from this, at all. This is in contrast to the 2 other books I mentioned earlier, which dedicated more space for some of the iconic games. But here, forcing everything to fit in half a page sometimes makes some reviews feel too short, especially for the popular releases that you would want to read more about. Then there's a section on the PAL exclusives, which are games originally released only for the PAL territories, which include Europe and Australia. There are 64 of these games reviewed here. Unsurprisingly, there are games based on popular European characters, such as Asterix and Obelix, Lucky Luke, the Smurfs, and Tintin, and boy, there sure are a lot of soccer games, though they call it football over there. Then we have the Super Famicom highlights. Unlike the always horizontal or landscape orientations of the Super NES game boxes, the Japanese Super Famicom game boxes were mostly vertically oriented. Thus, the page format is adjusted to fit them, so there are now 3 reviews per page. There are 336 games here, so combined with the 64 PAL exclusives, that's a nice round total of 400 games that North Americans may not have been familiar with. Now, the book does clearly state that this section of Japanese games is only listing the highlights, as there are actually over 1,400 Japanese games. This book is a complete SNES, not the complete Super Famicom after all. So the handpicked 336 games here are noteworthy ones, most that don't require much or any fluency in Japanese to enjoy. So there are more Mystical Ninja games, more Super Ninja Boy games, more Super Bomberman games, and of course plenty of games based on anime franchises, some still unheard of in the West today, but also including those that hadn't achieved international popularity at the time, such as the multitude of Sailor Moon and Dragon Ball Z games. So after over 500 pages covering over 1,100 official games, we get into a section called Grails and Unreleased Games. This details artifacts such as competition cartridges, and also takes a look at a prototype unit of the Nintendo PlayStation, which, as you can probably guess if you didn't know already, was a CD-based platform co-developed with Sony. Also, there are things like the Exertainment Life Fitness Cycle for cycling games, and the Nintendo Super System designed for arcades to preview Super NES games, which actually seems kind of funny when I think about it, since home consoles are widely attributed to the demise of arcades, so this was like advertising for the competition. Still, a hardcore collector might actually have such an arcade cabinet, as there is even a collector's checklist for the dozen or so available interchangeable games for it. Then it continues on with descriptions of cancelled games in the same format as the earlier reviews, though there is no checklist on the bottom, obviously, except for the few games that have been restored and released later by Pico Interactive. Then there is a portion of the book dedicated to homebrew games, and, as you might expect, the quality of these games is all over the place, and some of these games are works in progress and are incomplete as of the time of this book's publication. Interestingly, it also talks about the flash cartridges available for the Super NES, including the Power Pack, the EverDrive, and the SD2 SNES. Nearing the end of the book are Kickstarter backer reviews, so those who contributed to the making of this book get a quick claim to fame by writing a paragraph about a game. Most are okay, though one is really short, and several feel like the writers are just showing off the trivia they know related to a particular game. After some bios of the main contributors and Jeffrey Wittenhagen himself, there are a few random magazine scans showing some Super NES advertisements from back in the day. And there we go. That is the complete SNES Collector's Book and Ultimate Guide Definitive Edition. So now that we've walked through this book, what do I think? Well, let's get the not so great stuff out of the way first. Unfortunately, there are quite a number of things I didn't get or would have done differently. Firstly, the book has a few errors. Not many, and maybe some are almost expected considering the amount of content here. But I did notice them. In the interest of time, I'll show a handful here on screen rather than talk about each of them. The individual errors may seem minor, but you know, having correct information is kind of the point of any reference book like this, so these do keep the book from perfection. A more frequent oddity is the strange design choice that is on every page. The game's details are written in black text with a red outline, which is an odd and garish combination. While these are the colors associated with the packaging and logos for the Super NES, against the white background here, it's a little hard on the eyes. And why is the number of players in parentheses, and why is it listed first, even before the title? Wouldn't it make more sense to just list it later and in the same format as the other details? Like, players : 1 to 4? This isn't a deal breaker, but it's definitely a head scratcher. Now, visual consistency is often a good thing, and I do usually appreciate the idea of a minimalist style, but this still seems a little bland. At the very least, the pages could have had more to them, or even just a solid background color but different per each regional section of the book. Something like white for the Americas, blue for Europe, red for Japan, and something else for homebrew perhaps. Between the American and European releases, sometimes I was confused as to which section I'd turn to if I just flipped to a random page. But if the page borders were a distinct color per section, there would have been no question. There are random scans of magazine pages at the back, which are mostly advertisements of the Super NES and its games from the 90s. But the Light World map ripped directly from The Legend of Zelda: A Link to the Past coverage in Volume 34 of Nintendo Power is confusing, as it mentions page numbers within that particular issue of Nintendo Power, which obviously don't match anything in this book. I mean, why don't they just use the maps from VG-Maps? Also, I found the Kickstarter backer review section odd, as you would think there would at least be a small image of the game's box art next to the reviews to more easily see at a glance what each review is of, or perhaps an icon or footnote in the main review section for each of these games saying that one of these alternate reviews or descriptions is available back here. They are not in any clear order, not alphabetical by the game's titles or even the first or last names of the backers, so the section is just not as helpful as it could be. And in the controller section at the start of the book, there is no mention of the ASCII pad, which is iconic, come on. Or at least certainly more so than Interact's SN program pad. But a more glaring question than about the choice of controllers worth mentioning is, why isn't the controller page formatted to have the descriptions of the controllers actually next to the photos of them? As with the accessories and Grail sections, I did find the layouts of the text and photos to be a little too simple, and lacking a professional polish. Now, the book is called the Definitive Edition, but doesn't really seem like it. For instance, it features some homebrew games that are incomplete, which means that if and when those games do ever get updated and or completed, this book is not accurate anymore. Plus, homebrew games are still being made. The Complete SNES would have actually seemed more complete by omitting the homebrew section entirely, as that could never truly be complete as long as there's still interest in Super NES homebrew, which I imagine is far from over. Maybe it wouldn't have been so bad if this was called the 2nd edition or 2018 edition or something not so final sounding. Now I know I'm sounding pretty harsh on this book, but the thing about physical books is that presentation is key. Information is so readily available on the internet. If the info is going to be curated and compiled into a nice package to be read and referenced and enjoyed offline, it should look nice and be as error-free as possible, as, unlike information online, it can't be updated or corrected after it's been printed. Considering this already is an updated version, that's why I have to question, why are there all these issues that I can point out? Or maybe it's because my expectations or standards for this book are high, since this is all about my favorite game console of all time. But really, despite all my criticisms, what we want is a big book about the Super NES, right? That is indeed what we have here. It is the Super NES library, so in terms of source material, you really can't go wrong here. We've got a lot of great games, some of the greatest of all time to look back on. If you feel like dusting off the Super NES and having some 16-bit fun, just browsing this book, you can easily find something you would like to relive, or you may be interested to try and find games you never heard of until discovering them here in this book. The descriptions are short yet concise, which is good. No massive walls of text here. If, instead of as a reference, you actually wanted to read it cover to cover like I did, it's a relatively breezy read, despite being over 600 pages. And enjoyable if you can get past the red outlines on the black text. And despite the particular factual errors I point out earlier, in the context of so many reviews, it's not huge percentage-wise. For every one wrong bit of information, there are thousands of correct bits, so you're still going to learn a lot by reading this book. I mean, come on, over 1,100 games? Who actually knows of that many games? Well, Jeffrey Wittenhagen does, as he put this massive book together, which is clearly a labor of love. 16-bit love, that is. And who doesn't love 16-bit stuff? Yet despite that many people do love this generation and consider it one of the best in gaming, there are not many books about it. So even if I can nitpickingly poke holes at the book's claim to be the definitive edition of the Ultimate Guide, at the very least, it's still a big book with a lot of Super NES stuff in it, so it remains a good and comprehensive resource for all 16-bit Nintendo fans. And now a clarification. When I filmed this review, I truly believe that this is the only book of its kind for the Super NES. However, in the few days that it has taken to edit this, I have, by chance, come across two other books. The Ultimate Nintendo Guide to the SNES Library, by Pat Contry, and the SNES Omnibus, The Super Nintendo and Its Games, Volume 1, A to M, by Brett Weiss. However, while the first volume of the SNES Omnibus is available now, the second volume for the remaining games, as well as Pat Contry's Ultimate Nintendo Guide to the SNES Library, both aren't expected to be released until spring 2019, so I will almost certainly be reviewing both of these as well, but next year. Unless I get a super advanced copy, hint hint. So if you're watching this in 2018, the Complete SNES is still the only book that I know of that takes on the entire Super NES library. And knowing these other books exist does not change my rating or recommendation. I feel the concise paragraphs, if you like your books to be quick reads, and the focus on the Japanese games that I don't believe will be featured in these other books, still make the Complete SNES worth a look. Each book will have their own take on things, so comparison is best left for later, when I actually have them in my hands. So stay tuned. So I give the Complete SNES Collector's Book and Ultimate Guide, Definitive Edition, a 3.5 out of 5. This book isn't perfect, but for 16-bit fans, it is still quite recommendable. You can buy it from Hagen's Alley Books. The link is here and in the description below. Wow, that was quite the review. Comment below with what you think of this video or of this book, or if you're going to pick one up. And if you would like to see more videos like this, be sure to like, share, and subscribe. Until next time, see ya.